So, gentlemen, welcome to the next Zoom meet where you all know, of course, that's why there's so many of you here. We have the esteemed John Ott doing a cool anniversary acknowledgement of an event that happened 162 years ago. So, with that, I would like to turn it over to John.
All right. Yeah, if I can get my dog to stop barking in the background there.
So,
But anyway, yeah, I'm going to share my screen and we'll get the show on the road. Yeah, let's see. All right. Now, what we're going to be talking about today is one of my favorite locomotives.
John, we
Hello,
don't see we don't see your screen
you don't see my screen. Okay, hang on. What do you got?
yet.
You got a black screen?
I see all of you all.
All right, hang on.
Yep.
I got to get back here. And go to share screen. All
There you
right,
go.
there we go. What we're going to be talking about is everybody's favorite locomotive, the General.
Hmm.
And I always thought it was really interesting that I don't know of any other locomotive in American history that's been stolen as many times as the General. We all know about the first time it got stolen, and I'm not going to repeat too much about that story this time because everybody knows about it. But the rest of the history of the General, I find just fascinating. And I hope you guys do too. I hope you're patient enough to stick around for it. But we all know about the first time, of course. What about the other three times? We all know how the General started. Started as a decent Rogers locomotive back in 1855. This is my rendering of it. Everybody, of course, who restores locomotives has got their own favorite little slant on the thing. But this is mine, and a lot of you guys have copies of this one way or the other. It was part of a batch of 5 that was bought from the Rogers Locomotive Works. Rogers, Ketchum, Grosvenor, governor, president, general, senator, chieftain. They all had the same specs. They were all bought within a little bit over a year's period. And I believe they all had more or less the same appearance. They're all supposed to be freight locomotives. And for the first 7 years of its life, General had a very unremarkable life hauling freight trains between Chattanooga and Atlanta. Until that fateful day, April 12th, 1862, when it went down in railroad history. We all know about the first time. What about the second time it was stolen? That was when Atlanta was evacuated by the Confederates in September of 1864. If you watched Gone with the Wind, you kind of got the story. The General was at the head of a supply train. It was supposed to be one of the 2 last trains out. But before that could happen, the line south from Atlanta came under fire from Union artillery. So everybody's favorite bad general, John Bell Hood, ordered that the 2 trains be backed up into the yards of the Schofield and Markham rolling mill and set the whole batch on fire. 81 cars with supplies and ammunition went up in flames that night. And supposedly 5 locomotives were destroyed or abandoned. And this is what the scene looked like when the Union Army photographer, George Bernard, showed up, maybe in the next week, maybe 10 days. I don't really know. date doesn't seem to be recorded. This wasn't the next morning, although it kind of looks like it. This was after some work had been done. You can see the wreck of the rolling mill. You can see the wreck of the two ammunition trains. And just out of the picture is the general. Now, there's been a lot of questions about this picture, some of them wondering if it's the general at all. And that's because Bernard labeled the thing as the old hero of the Andrews raid. And a few book authors after that picked up on that and decided, well, this engine was called the Hero. The only problem with that is that in all the rosters of all the railroads in Tennessee and Georgia and Alabama, there are no locomotives that ever got named Hero. And by doing a little forensics and a little investigatory searching of the photograph, you can kind of figure out what else is going on. And you can kind of make some guesses as to where the other locomotives were or are. And the fact that this one, that George Bernard went to so much trouble to take a couple of photographs of, was actually the general itself. You look in the background of the photograph, you can see two old Norris engines. You can see their smokestacks anyway. You can identify them as Norris engines.
Wow.
By the fact that they have the narrow smokestacks. We know that two old Norris engines were left behind, the NC Monroe and the EY Hill. And that's two of the five. And then you can see the wrecks of the ammunition and supply trains. And if you bother, like I did, to go and start counting the axles and the wheels on the thing as best you can figure out that they're both of them 40-car trains.
Wow.
So that makes that kind of, yeah, they were 40-car supply trains. You can tell that most of them were supplies, not ammunition, because most of them burned in place. You zoom in on the axles, and you can tell they're in sets of 8. So yeah, the cars just burned to the ground. Some other curious details that you can find in this thing. You can find a pile of locomotive driver tires between the two tracks. And I'm pretty sure they had absolutely nothing to do with the locomotives that were left behind. Number one, there's the tires, but where's the rest of the wheels? I mean, you know, we're talking about, if we're talking about explosions, we're talking about black powder. We're talking about kegs of musket powder, cannon powder. Nothing that would really blow a locomotive to smithereens. You might have pieces here and there, but nothing would just absolutely up and disappear. So you got these locomotive tires, but you don't have any wheels to go along with them. What happened there? You also have a car down here, rolled down the hill. This obviously is a car that went boom. You can see the explosion crater in the middle of the picture. So that obviously went boom, dished in the ground. Looks to me like all the powder was in just a few cars. Either that or they just stacked up all the powder kegs and lit them off. You can see off the far side of the track, there's a locomotive tender tank. Now, the General obviously still has its tender. So of the 3 other locomotives that were, or the 2 other locomotives that were unaccounted for, one of them, the Etowah, was out of service. And I really doubt it's there on the scene. It was probably abandoned at the Roundhouse back in downtown Atlanta. So that just leaves this to be the tender tank of the Missouri, which is the last locomotive that isn't accounted for. And this is really curious because the Missouri is nowhere in these pictures. Now, it may be off to the side somewhere, or it may have been towed away. It certainly wasn't wrecked because you can't see it anywhere.
Hmm.
It's not anywhere in the radius of the explosion. What is there? Very curious. If you look real carefully down here in the corner, you can see the top to a sandbox and the lid, which matches up to the fact that the General is minus its sandbox. The General got pretty badly beat up, as the photographs show. Let's see. But it is forward of the train. You can tell it's several hundred feet in front of where the ammunition trains were. So it got either towed there after the explosion or something like that, because it really wasn't close enough to the explosion. If it was found where it was set, it wasn't close enough to the explosion to get as badly damaged as it was.
Hmm.
You can see it's got the cab blown away. Most telling to me, it's got the side of the tender caved in. The belt rail is bent under the cab. It's missing the sandbox. It's missing the bell. The bell could have probably been swiped as a souvenir by a Union soldier. Doesn't have a headlight. Doesn't have a handrail. Doesn't have a nameplate. And it's obviously been hit rather bad by flying debris. Now, the engine is still on the track, though. Its main rods weren't dropped. You can see the main rods here. So the engine's movable. It's towable. It may even be able to be fired, as far as all I know. All the damage could have been superficial to the boiler jacket and the dome jackets. There's a wood insulation under the jackets. It could be that the boiler was still intact. It was intact enough that the Union Army decided to appropriate the engine. That's how it got stolen the second time. But go and compare that to the story that everybody tells. It's really doubtful that the engine was run backwards into the Missouri and the whole thing blew up like some of the books and some of the sources will tell you. James Bogle, who was one of the big collectors of information on the General, the author of a couple books, that was his version of the thing. But I tend to doubt it. I think the General kind of got through this with a lot of superficial injuries, but not a great deal wrong with it. Let's go back to that forensics picture for one more point. You can see the main line here, and notice that the main line doesn't line up with the rest of the track. It's kind of dished in here toward that explosion crater. I kind of have the theory that maybe they respiked the track to haul the General away. That was probably one of the things that the Union Army was doing during this period of time when they occupied the city of Atlanta. They only occupied the city of Atlanta for 3 months before they packed up and left for Savannah. I don't know how long it took them to restore railroad service going back north to Chattanooga, but salvaging the locomotives as best they could was probably relatively high on their priority list. And I think this probably up here next to the explosion crater was where they found the General, and they just put it back on the tracks and started the process of towing it away. The engine was requisitioned by the Union Army. It became U.S. Military Railroad's Division of the Mississippi number 218. It was towed to Nashville to get repaired. But at that time, the USMRR had over 200 other engines in that theater of the war. And they didn't really need it, and best we can tell, no work was done. The engine was given back to the Western and Atlantic Railroad in October 1865. Then they made the notation that, yeah, the thing needs repairs. So it was patched up and returned to service in 1866 for a cost of $2,887, which for context was about a third of the brand new price of the locomotive. So they did some work on it. About that time, and I know there's a lot of arguments pro and con, but this was about the time the railroad adopted numbers, and General became 39. Then that went on for a few years, but then they started to make some big changes. In 1871, they gave the engine a new boiler. The boiler, more or less, we think that it has today. It had a single steam dome instead of two steam domes. It had a new smoke box, or at least a smoke box front. It was given new cylinders, new sandbox, new cab, new pilot, probably a whole new tender. The engine was also converted to burn coal. And so it had a diamond stack that replaced the Radley Hunter balloon stack, which it had as a woodburn. The 39 was derived from the fact that it was the 39th oldest locomotive at that time. But sometime during the mid-1880s, after they had scrapped a bunch of the older locomotives, the number was changed to 3, since the engine was the third oldest remaining on the railroad. When the track gauge was changed from 5 foot to 4 foot 9 inches in June 1886, the adjustment to the drivers was made simply by moving the tires in an inch and a half. And they're still that way. Somebody's been crawling around under the General, and they measured it wheel back to wheel back, found out it was still a 5 foot gauge locomotive. They just pounded in the tire rims a little bit to fit the new track gauge. Also had new lift wheels given to the tender and the pilot. That wasn't a big deal. Engine swapped out those wheels all the time. But after that, very few improvements were made. There wasn't any brakes installed on the engine, although at one point there, you can see between the drivers, there was an air compressor installed. The engine never got injectors. It was always the water always came from a crosshead pump. There was no locomotive, and nobody really wanted to spend money on it. However, it was remembered as being the locomotive from the Great Chase. And starting in the 1880s, it started to be sent out to Veterans Affairs. Here we have, I don't know what this affair was in 1887, but it's got the notation that old conductor William Fuller standing by the tender. Fuller being the conductor that chased after the locomotive during the chase. He shows up in a lot of these photos. Seems like, hey, let's get a photo of the guy next to the locomotive. That happened so many times.
John, I got a question for you.
Sure.
Just in front of the cab and below that running board, what is that long cylindrical thing between the two drivers?
That is the air pump.
Oh,
They didn't put any brakes on the locomotive. However, they did install an air pump.
okay.
So that if the thing was hauling a train that actually had Westinghouse brakes on it, it could supply the air for them.
And then the second question is another cylindrical thing just in front of the front driver. What is that?
Well, right in
What
front
the
of the front
ball?
driver, that's the pump. That's the water pump.
Oh, okay.
And then you got the water line over here to the check valve.
Now that water pump would have been on there in 1863.
Yeah,
Okay.
you can kind of tell by the style. It's got the cylindrical um, airlock on the top, and it's got the reach rod that you can see reaching down in front of the front driver. Um,
Oh, yeah, 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 yeah. Okay.
uh, oh, gee, what do you call it? The tricock there on the front of it. This would have been
Right.
original equipment.
Okay. That's a detail I want to add. Thank you for that.
Here's another picture of the locomotive. You can't really tell. This was taken at the Grand Army of the Republic encampment in Columbus, Ohio in 1888, a year after the previous one. There's William Fuller again. He's leaning up against the post on the right. And the rest of the codgers in the picture are all veterans of the raid. And this was a big deal back then. Everybody was celebrating the raid. Everybody was it was as famous as the raid ever got. This was about the time that William Pettinger, uh, his book of the raid, he was a survivor of the raid. His book came out. It was said that every veteran's home had a copy of that book in it. But railroads, corporations, they never let sentiment get in the way of making money. They decided that the general had lived out its lifetime and it was sent to the deadline in 1892. It spent about 6 months on the deadline, probably being scavenged for spare parts, things like that, until she was found by a professional photographer from Atlanta. His name was E. Warren Clark. He had a bright, brilliant idea, which he went and took to the president of the Nashville, Chattanooga, and St. Louis Railway, which by this time had rented or leased the Western Atlantic, to save the old locomotive and display her at the 1893 Chicago World's Fair. Great idea. So they took the general, took it back to the shops in Nashville, and they converted it from coal back to wood, make it a little bit more authentic. But then they very quickly changed it back to coal again when they realized, oops, no railroads burn wood anymore. Where are we going to find the wood stick in the tender? You couldn't just pull up to the station and load it up from the wood rick anymore. So they quickly converted it back to coal. They left on the big phony balloon stack, though. Other than that, they didn't do too much except clean the locomotive up and paint it.
Another question for you.
Sure, sure.
The pilot wheels on that previous photo are spoked.
Yep.
Was the original General with spoked pilot wheels? Do you know?
No, it was not. It had solid
Uh,
pilot wheels. Somewhere along the line, when the locomotive got rebuilt, it got those spoked wheels. It got a lot of weird stuff. It got a Rogers cap to its sandbox, which it didn't have at the beginning. This was a later version of the Rogers sandbox. Everybody likes that ribbed dome on the sandbox.
right.
That wasn't original equipment. I don't know whether they scavenged it from another locomotive or if they just went out and bought it on the open market. I don't know where they got all these parts when they rebuilt the locomotive. That's
Right.
a little bit beyond my pay grade. But anyway, E. Warren Clark is here sitting on the pilot. This particular picture was taken at the Chickamauga battlefield in 1892. He took the locomotive to the Chicago World's Fair. He spent a lot of his money advertising, and I don't know what else he spent his money on. But anyway, he went broke taking care of the locomotive. And so after the Chicago World's Fair, it was returned to Louisville and to the Nashville, Chattanooga, and St. Louis Railroad. their headquarters in Nashville. Here it is in 1895. And there's William Fuller again, bald-headed guy standing by the tender. This was at the Cotton States International Exhibition. So the General was a good show engine for the time. There you got a guy on the tender with an actual Confederate States flag, not the battle flag. But the railroad really didn't want to take care of a historical engine. So in 1901, they sent it to the Chattanooga Union Depot. Now, no paperwork changed hands, no money changed hands. It was a really informal arrangement. It was a gentleman's agreement. All this became very important later on. But for 60 years, this was the place where the General sat, with the exception of being taken out for shows every so often. The important part is that the engine didn't change hands. It was still property of the Western Atlantic, which was under lease to the Nashville, Chattanooga, and St. Louis. And that lease was good until the year 1970.
On top of the smoke box, it looks like sawtooth on the back half and then smooth on the front half.
Yeah, the chicken comb. The chicken comb was put on this version of the smokestack. I don't really know if it really had a reason. It was just kind of a decorative thing, as far as I know. It was you can find it on a few other pictures of old locomotives from this era. But you know what it did, what it was supposed to do, I don't really know. It's nothing that any of the books on the locomotives and how they operate. It's nothing that they talk about.
Mhm.
At this point, it's still a coal burner.
At this point, it is still a coal burner.
Yeah, I should have loaded wood in it though.
Yep, they loaded it up with wood. They just piled on the wood for looks, just
Thank
like
you.
they always did. But the best information I had was that, yeah, they tried to turn it back to a wood burner when they cleaned it up at the Nashville shops, but they very quickly turned it back into a coal burner so that they could actually run the thing on railroads going up to Chicago. That's their excuse anyway. I think the thing was probably just stuck on the end of a freight train and towed, but I really don't know the details. Those kinds of details are lost.
You know, the other thing that stands out with this photo and all the others is uh, the uh, uh, the drive rods, how narrow they are. And you know, when you're wanting to do something kind of prototypical, the need to file the ones that come at least from the Mantua down about half their size, and it really does make a difference in the look. It's a nice little detail. Thought I'd comment on that.
Yeah, it is. And that's always been a problem with model locomotives in HO.
Right.
On those driver wheels, those counterweights, do they every so often, like with new tires and so on, change it like car tires, or is it set?
As far as I know, they're on there permanently. They're riveted on there, front and back.
It's kind of where you have one in the back, but then two in the front.
I'm sorry?
There's one in the back, but then two in the front. So it makes me think they did actually balance them before they actually put them on.
Yep. That was pretty common. They figured out the poundage, and obviously the main rod is added on to the weight of the side rod. So they gave it two measures of weight to the one in the back. And yeah, you can find that on lots of locomotives from that period. In fact, a lot of them, the counterweight is only on that front wheel. That was before they really had a handle on the proper way to do it. Anyway, in the meantime, we're now into the 20th century. In 1903, a 21-year-old Midwestern art student, his name was Wilbur Kurtz, he became fascinated with the story of the Great Chase. He moved to Atlanta and began collecting interviews and reminiscences from all the surviving participants that he could get in contact with. And he also ended up marrying conductor William Fuller's daughter. So it was kind of like his family business. Figure out what was going on with the Great Chase and collect all the information that he could. And he started making paintings. And these paintings showed up in magazines and in shows around Atlanta. He really kept the story of the Great Chase alive into the 20th century, even though the participants in the Great Chase were kind of kicking off one by one. He became obsessed trying to figure out what his main subject looked like, because there were no photographs, of course, of the general in operating condition. Now, to this day, the only photographs of the general before it was rebuilt in 1871 are those two photos of it wrecked in Atlanta after the rolling mill was burned down. So he did his homework. He really did his homework. He took notes from all the old engine men that he could get a hold of. He did sketches. He educated himself as to how the locomotive worked. You can tell by some of the natures of his questions. He was really a novice when he began. He hardly understood how a locomotive operated. But he educated himself. And again, you know, by going back to the sources, people who actually saw the thing and ran the thing, he studied as best he could how the locomotive would have looked. Finding, studying, and sometimes stealing old photographs of similar engines from that time, similar Rogers engines. The one in the upper left, famous story. He went to prowling the offices of the Nashville, Chattanooga, and St. Louis Railway looking for old frame photographs of engines. And he found this one in the president's office. The president wasn't there at the time, but took the photograph down off the wall, down through the front, said, "Oh, I'll bring this back." Took it down to a photographer's studio and had copies made.
That's funny.
And as far as I know, the president got his photograph back. Everything was cool from then on. But being a young guy, well, Wilbur Kurtz was, I think you could say he was kind of obsessed with the whole subject.
Hmm.
But you can see by studying these photographs, there was a very common look to Rogers locomotives at that time. They were all built to more or less the same design, the same specs. They all had a very close family resemblance. Of course, he didn't have the stuff that we have today, like these 1856 Rogers drawings.
Wow.
Which is what I worked from when I made my restoration of the general. These were found actually in Britain.
No kidding.
And not only that, but they were made or copied for the sake of locomotives that were exported to Chile. So this was really kind of a worldwide search, finally locate these things. But man, have they been valuable for letting people like me know how this locomotive looked and how it operated.
Remarkable.
But Wilbur Kurtz, he was the inspiration for all the others. He made this painting of the general in 1909, and you can see his influence all to this day. He's the guy that nailed it. He came up with the first good restoration of what the general originally looked like.
On those photographs you showed that you got earlier, it looked like it was all the cow catcher was like vertical round rail, if I saw it right. And all the drawings I see look like they're all strap rail.
Yeah, well, in the drawing, that was how the cowcatcher came from the Rogers works.
Ah,
What you see in the illustrations is a Western Atlantic cowcatcher, which was made from the remnants of the strap rails that the Western Atlantic was originally made with.
Oh, wow.
The when the railroad first began operation, they used strap rails, which were big wooden hooks with a metal strap along the top edge.
mhm.
Yeah, they didn't work very well. They didn't work very long. They didn't work with very heavy locomotives. So yeah, they swapped them out very quickly, but they had all the strap rail left over. And as far as everybody talks about, that's what they used to make their own cow catchers.
John, do you have any idea why they swapped them out if they already came with a cow catcher?
Most likely because those iron rod cow catchers weren't very good. I mean, you go back and take a look at them. Let's see if we can find a. You can't find a good.
Well, those photographs, like 1856, and they had that round.
Yeah, here we go.
Oh.
Like up here in the
Oh,
toner. You look at those things; they're not very sturdy.
right.
They're worth maybe one cow. One cow.
John,
So
is there any credence to the Western Atlantic ordering a locomotive without a pilot at all, and just as a cost-saving measure?
that's a very good theory. It could have been that way. You do know that they never were ordered. They never were delivered with headlights.
Yeah,
The
those,
headlights were always supplied by the railroad.
and I think that was a practice among other railroads, but I can't speak for the Western Atlantic. That they, you could kind of pick and choose between the accessories you wanted or didn't want. So I don't know. I'm just throwing that out there. I have no idea whether that's
No, that's a very good theory. You know, I fully subscribe to that. We just don't know for sure because nobody bothered to write it down. But let's see. Wilbur Kurtz went on to, he was kind of the go-to expert for anything related to railroading in the Civil War after a while. He also wrote newspaper and magazine articles. And I think that he was fairly instrumental in getting Buster Keaton to make his movie on the General. I know that Keaton's biography says that Keaton read William Pittenger's book, but so did everybody else. More telling to me was that he made the General in the mid 1920s, just after a storm of articles in newspapers and magazines, either written by Kurtz or inspired by what Kurtz wrote on the Great Chase. There was like a flurry of newspaper and magazine articles at that time. So he probably read William Pittenger's book, but it was probably brought to his attention by something that he read in one of the newspapers talking about the chase. And William Kurtz was technical advisor to Walt Disney's Great Locomotive Chase. But more importantly, he was the advisor on Gone with the Wind. Now, it really helped that he personally knew Margaret Mitchell. They went around in the same circles down in Atlanta society. And Margaret Mitchell, when she was talking to the movie people, recommended William Kurtz or Wilbur Kurtz as the a go-to source for everything that related to the siege of Atlanta. And that's how they came up with the whole idea of the fire in the train yards, which was, you know, it was a gross exaggeration of what happened at the rolling mill, but you know, hey, it was movie making.
Right. It's interesting that they got an Atlanta and West Point label on that one car. That's interesting.
Yep. Western Atlantic, yeah. All of them have different railroad names to them. Georgia RR on the last car.
Right.
Yeah, he undoubtedly got that all from they got this all from William Kurtz
Right.
or Wilbur Kurtz. I keep calling him William Kurtz. Wilbur Kurtz. And in the meantime, the general just sat in Chattanooga, the real general. They wanted to use it for Gone with the Wind. However, the movie studio got wind of the shipping cost, bring the thing out to the West Coast, and they decided against it. Whatever locomotives you saw in the movie, I think they all got more or less cut out, left on the cutting room floor, but they were all wooden replicas.
On the cab, what's in those two round things? Yeah.
That's a good question, and I don't know for sure what they are. They're temporary because sometimes you see them, sometimes you don't on pictures of the general. I think it was probably, they were probably picture holders,
Right.
maybe portraits in there at one point, but who they were. William Fuller, some politician, I don't know. There was also signs stuck to the edge of the cab telling the story. You see the signs over here, kind of stuck in the valve gear.
Oh yeah.
While the workmen work on the tracks going down the middle of the Chattanooga station depot.
Between the engine and tender, what's that rod that goes down to the wheels? Yeah.
This one right here,
Yeah, what's that rod?
Step.
it's their step. You can see the step down here.
Oh, okay.
Step into the cab. You put your foot here, put your second foot here, third foot up here.
Yeah.
Those things are high. I mean, if you try to get into a locomotive cab without a step, you know it's kind of hard to do.
The engine was moved since the earlier photograph had the rods down. The rods are up in this one.
Yep. Well, the thing was taken out every so often. That's going to be the next slide.
Huh?
The general attended several affairs during that period of time. Besides the GAR encampment, it was taken out 1897, 1906, 1927. It was taken out for the Fair of the Iron Horse in Baltimore. 1933, Century of Progress exhibition in Chicago. 1939, at the New York World's Fair, which is where this picture was taken. And I don't really know what else it was taken out for. It may have been taken out for some local events. But at that point, the city of Chattanooga was willing to let it go because it kind of had faith that the engine was going to be returned. But all that ended in 1957. Nashville, Chattanooga, and St. Louis Railway merged with the Louisville and Nashville. All properties and leases were transferred to the Louisville and Nashville. That included all the remaining assets of the Western Atlantic, which, of course, included the General.
Yeah, I was going to say the General at this time was painted completely black.
Correct. Correct. It only got that's next slide where it gets its gaudy paint job. But this time, yeah, it was all black with a little bit of gold paint on the tender. The lettering and striping and so
Yeah.
forth.
I remember seeing it as a child.
Wonderful, wonderful. That was one of the questions I was going to ask a few slides later on. How many of you guys actually saw the thing when it was out and about and in the wild? But anyway, now we're coming up to the third time the General got stolen. In 1959, the state of Georgia convinced the Louisville and Nashville to grant them custody of the General so that Atlanta could display it at Stone Mountain Park. We had the new Confederate memorial going there. They had what they thought was a good claim to the locomotive. The city of Chattanooga raised a stink about it and railroad back down. But that got their back up. In 1961, Louisville and Nashville got the bright idea, oh, let's fix up the General and send it out on tour as a publicity thing for the Civil War centennial. This was the this was the age of Mad Men advertising people, and the Louisville and Nashville publicity department just kind of went crazy over this idea. The city of Chattanooga was now very wary about stuff like this, and they opposed this idea too. So again, go back to that television show, which I thought was pretty great, Mad Men. The Louisville and Nashville publicity department patched the scheme. They swiped the locomotive in the middle of the night. On June 6, 1961, after the last train had left, the station was empty of travelers. They put in a little bit of temporary track, and they towed the thing away. Took it out to the Louisville Nashville train yard. They put it under wraps on flat cars, took it away to Louisville.
Unbelievable.
And they wasn't discovered until they opened up the station the next day.
Jeez.
And yeah, with much understatement, there was much outrage in Chattanooga. Unfortunately, they didn't have their act together at that time. Again, they had the General all these years, all these 60 years. It was under a gentleman's agreement. And there was no paperwork, there was no documentation, there was nothing that they could take and go in front of a judge at that time to do anything about it. So consequently, they didn't do anything about it. The newspapers made the big noise about it, but the government of the city of Chattanooga really, I guess, felt it was helpless at that time. Anyway, away went the General back to the Louisville and Nashville shops. And they did damage to the locomotive. We don't know what, because it is not documented to this day. If it's documented, I sure can't find it. Neither can any of my friends. We just don't know what all they did to the General. It is said that a lot of the original fabric, whatever was left of the locomotive, was destroyed in the process of making it fit to go out on tour. The engine was converted to burn oil. They hid the oil tank under the wood pile on the tender. They also installed air brakes, an injector, and they even put a small diesel engine in the tender so they could move it around without having to raise steam. Now, something really suspicious to me, they rated the boiler at 175 pounds. And as far as I can tell, it's still the same boiler from 1871. So that really doesn't make sense. They wouldn't have, I don't think that they would have done that. They said the working pressure was 125 pounds. But even that is really high for a boiler of that age. I mean, you go up to Nevada City, and when they fire up the Inyo, they're running under 100 pounds. They're really wary about pushing these old boilers. And I can't find anything that says that they swapped out the boiler on the General at this time. 1962. And I can't find any photographs of that, that would document that either. So that's kind of a mystery. I don't know what was going on there. The engine also got its present red, black, yellow, and silver paint scheme. And they buttoned it up, it was ready to go. Now, how much they actually steamed it is another open question. I think they claimed that it was under steam for a lot more miles than it actually was. We know that it went from town to town on a flat car. They would usually, the day before the big show, they would park it a little ways away from town, take it off the flat car, put it on the tracks, and then have the thing steam for the last couple of miles coming into town. But, again, it's really hard to find documentation on any of that. I've looked and looked, and I can't even find a itinerary that they took the general on. So you got to kind of take Louisville and Nashville Railroad. You got to kind of take their word for it on whatever statistics that they give. And I really don't trust them at all. Another weird thing is they paired it up with a steel underframe Jim Crow combine from 1913.
I was just going to that.
Yeah, you can't you can't tell me that they couldn't find another historical car somewhere to hook up behind that locomotive. I think it was an odd decision, even for 1962. This was the height of the civil rights era. And to send the general out with a segregation car behind it, I just don't understand that. But that's what they did. And they held a reenactment of the Great Chase down in Big Shanty, Georgia, April 62. And supposedly that year, the locomotive traveled 14,000 miles. They claimed that it was 9,000 of those under steam. I don't believe it. 120 cities and 12 states from April to December. The feat was more or less repeated in 1963 to bring the total to 287 towns and cities in 17 states. I'm sure a lot of those were just passing through, but at any rate, claimed that the locomotive went 11,000 miles under its own power. I don't believe it.
Hey, John.
Go ahead.
John, this is George. Can I ask you why you don't believe it? Just out of curiosity. I'm kind of curious on that now, other than the flat cars.
I really don't think that the engine was in that great a shape to travel 11,000 miles after. Remember, it had 20 years of service, 1871, the time it was retired around 1892. And then from that point on, it really was just kind of neglected. There wasn't any major work done on it until 1962. And I admit this is more of gut feeling than anything else, but I don't think they spent any more money on this thing than they actually needed to. It was far easier to write good advertising copy than actually come up with a restored working locomotive from that era that would travel like that many thousand miles.
Sure. And I understand where you're talking about with putting it on the flat car and everything like that to carry it around and then putting it out. But my understanding of steam engines and FRA has certain rules that you have to do with the hydrostat test and stuff like that. That, in my estimation, would say that they would at least be how shall I say, qualified to run it under pressure, because without that, it would have to undergo a 1472 And I would think that if they're putting an injector on it and all the other stuff that they did to it and converting it to oil and all that, that it would basically start a new 1472, or at least that's my guess.
Yep. Well, yeah, I admit all this. I don't have any real decent arguments against it, just gut feeling. Again, I don't think they spent any more money on it than they had to. And yeah, it was operable. But, you know, even back then, in the 1960s, you couldn't run a steam locomotive 11,000 miles without servicing it. And what kind of service did they have available for it? They probably, my thought would be that they tried to get as many miles out of this thing as they possibly could, which meant conserving it as much as they possibly could. They ran it for 2 years and then took it to the New York World's Fair on the 3rd year. That's a lot for any steam locomotive. So anyway, yeah, it was a good discussion. I'm willing to look at any evidence that anybody can have, or anybody can come up with. I'd love to see an itinerary. I'd love to see a report on exactly what kind of a condition the locomotive was in when they sent it out. I'd love to find out what they did to the boiler to bring it up to specs, and so that it would pass 175 pounds hydrostatic. But for the time being, I don't know, and I can't find that.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, yeah, my last comment was I can't find that information. It's just kind of still an open question to me. But I do know that I do know you got to be suspicious of any sort of advertising claims.
Oh, of course.
We're talking about the Louisville and Nashville Railroad, and I find it really hard to trust that what they're saying is God's own truth.
Well, it certainly would make sense to me why it hasn't run since.
Yep. Yeah. Well, that's another thing to consider. Well, the thing ended up at the New York World's Fair, 1964. Then after the fair, the engine was taken back to Louisville, stored at the L&N headquarters. And as far as I can tell, it was only steamed up one more time for a 1966 governor's conference. It tells me that they were cutting corners, that they were trying to, again, stretch this thing as many miles as they could. And they just, they'd run the thing to the limit. I think that they were probably getting word back from people in the know that, you don't want to push this locomotive any further than it's already been pushed. So after 1966, dead locomotive. Chattanooga wanted it back, but the L&N wasn't playing games with it. So the locomotive was stolen for a 4th time. In 1967, the L&N announced it was sending the general to a new museum being prepared for it in Kennesaw. This time, the city of Chattanooga was prepared. They had their lawyers out in force. In the pre-dawn hours of September 12th, 1967, they had made the mistake of sending the general by way of a freight train through the city of Chattanooga. The train carrying the general rumbled into the railroad yards on its way. Overhead, the city of Chattanooga had a spotter plane waiting for the train. They alerted the mayor. The mayor ordered the police and all the city officials to go out and block the tracks. He showed up along with all the city commissioners, armed with court order from Hamilton County Chancellor Ray Brock, and accompanied by a squad of policemen who boarded the freight train. The L&N's representative stepped forward and challenged the mayor, saying this train is going through. Deputy sheriff responded, if you do, you'll be charged with kidnapping.
Huh.
The mayor asserted that the general's story is Chattanooga's story. And after a little further heated discussion, they decided that the car was going to stay in Chattanooga. It was cut out, parked in the train yards. The rest of the train was released to continue its journey. The general sat on a siding in the Chattanooga train yards for 3 months while they fought over it, negotiated it. They finally ended up saying, you know, basically, yeah, we can't leave this thing just sitting out here in the open. They took it back to the Louisville and Nashville headquarters in Louisville while the court cases went forward. And here you see the original, this is how the barn looked. The barn in Kennesaw.
Right.
That's how they had it prepared for the general. This is the way the museum looks like. Well, this is what it looks like more or less today.
Right.
Lawyers for Chattanooga went to court. They claimed ownership of the locomotive based on half a century of implied contracts and prescriptive interests. Prescriptive interest meaning we've had the thing longer than anybody else. We have more right to the thing than anybody. Yeah, like right. Is this going to stand up in court? No. The Louisville and Nashville maintained that it, through its ownership of the Nashville, Chattanooga, and St. Louis, and its lease on the Western and Atlantic, which remember runs through 1970, never gave up ownership of the locomotive. It could dispose of its property as it saw fit. So yeah, the U.S. District Court decided in favor of Louisville and Nashville.
Yeah.
The appeals went all the way to the United States Supreme Court. And all the appeals courts just let the prior decision stand. And the final decision came down from the Supreme Court in November 1970. And so the railroad really didn't want to be in the historical locomotive business anymore. Again, corporations, they don't want to spend money where they don't have to. So the railroad gave the general to the state of Georgia by deed of gift, something official this time. And in Kennesaw, the old Frey family cotton gin was turned into the museum. The general arrived by rail in February 1972. This time they sent the thing the long way around so that they didn't have to take the railroad through Chattanooga. So, you know, they just did not trust the city of Chattanooga not to pull something else.
Right.
And yeah, to this day, information on the locomotive's condition is really hard to come by. I've had friends that have gone to the museum people and tried to talk to them. They just kind of look at you funny. They don't have any information. They can't tell you what the condition of the locomotive is in, what the age of the parts are. They're just kind of babysitting the thing.
So basically, no inspection's been done on that engine since it last ran in the 60s.
If it has, they haven't publicized it. They haven't put it on the internet. They don't make it available. And when people go walk right up to them and ask them about it, they don't know nothing.
Is it a remote
Sorry?
Is it a remote possibility that the some offices in Louisville or Nashville have this information, but it's under wraps, or
It's entirely possible, Tom, but you know, there's no Louisville and Nashville anymore.
That's right, right.
The whole thing has been folded into Norfolk Southern or wherever, whichever of the successor railroads got it.
Okay.
And I doubt that they kept any records. All these things just seem to be, you know.
It's CSX now.
So here she sits until somebody steals her again.
Yeah.
Which,
Can
you
you
know,
back up
who knows?
one photo? Because it looked like in just the photo previous, that chicken comb went all the way around if I was seeing it. And all these
No.
other photos look like it's just on the back half.
Yeah, somebody was up in the balcony. You see the balcony right here, off to the right.
Well, maybe
That's
it
an
is just the
optical.
back half. Okay.
Yeah.
And then, yeah, somebody, yeah, you can't sneak around the back side of it and take pictures. You can get around. You can get around at 360 degrees, as far as I know, and then get up in the balcony and take pictures from the top. Looks like a nice setting. Looks like a nice museum. I hope to get there someday.
Was that an old milepost marker?
Yeah,
Yep.
probably.
Huh, okay.
They have a bunch of other stuff there. I don't know exactly what the contents of the museum are.
John, can you comment on the different numbers that it's used over the years?
Yeah, it was numbered 39 because it was the 39th locomotive. But nobody really can agree on when they actually started using numbers for the locomotives. This was not unusual for railroads in that period of time, and especially in the South. Railroads in the South were usually pretty small. They had small fleets of locomotives, and they really didn't need numbers, at least according to the people who operated the railroads at that time. It was only the big railroads in the East, like the Pennsylvania, the Baltimore, Ohio, the Erie. They were the only ones that really used numbers extensively. So nobody really can agree on when they started putting the numbers on the locomotives. My best guess is that they did it after the Civil War, sometime between 1866 and 1871. One of Wilbur Kurtz's informants, a guy named John Bell, who had actually run the locomotive after the Civil War, had the number painted on the sandbox, according to his description of the locomotive. So at least from sometime between 1866 and 1871, the locomotive got the number 39 painted on it. It probably got a number plate about that time too. Sometime in the early 1880s, the Western Atlantic did a renumbering. And again, they numbered them sequentially from oldest to newest. And at that time, the General got the number 3. And that's the way she's stayed ever since. But it was on the deadline in 1892, it was number 3. When they cleaned it up in Nashville, they kept the number 3, and it's been number 3 ever since.
I wonder what 1 and 2 were.
Oh, yeah, I could probably find that out if I could find a roster from the early 1880s. There's probably one out there somewhere, but yeah, there's probably a couple of other engines from about that same era who were on the roster at that time. Texas was later on. It had a higher number, so and it was renumbered in the 1880s. I forget what number it had, but it was given the number that it has today.
Texas, I thought was 49.
49. Yeah, that makes sense. That was about that. There's about 10 engines between the General and Texas. Texas was ordered a couple months later, was delivered at least a year later.
You know, I had been paying attention, but I just noticed the cab, it does not have a curved roof. Is that Rogers engines basically had that straight sides, not a curved roof on the cab?
As far as I know,
Okay.
again, you know, as far as I can tell, this was the cab that it had in the 1880s and 1890s. But you know, who knows? It may have gotten a new cab somewhere along the line.
We had a conversation about that a while ago, and it came up that somebody saw I forget if it was the photo or if it came out of Kurtz's books, but the roof on the original General was not a peaked roof. It was a curved roof,
Yeah, yeah,
right?
right, right. Yeah, the roof that got blown off in the Civil War, it was definitely a curved roof, because that's the
Right.
way Rogers locomotives came.
Okay.
But
And
after that period of time, of course, photos of the General are fairly scarce. So
mhm.
you know, we've got to kind of make judgments from what we can see from ground level, because that's about the only place they took photographs from.
Right. Just a little side note, when we were out there in Kennesaw in like 2003 or 2004, we did our first uh, annual meet there. I mean, it was LeBron, DC, myself, Brian, and a guy named Chris Brannigan. And Brian got to be real buddy with the curator there.
Uh-huh.
And one night he was out over to this guy's place, and they were, I guess, knocking down a couple of shots and having some good conversation. And next morning, we're back in the museum, and the curator says, "Come back at the end of the day. I got something for you." We said, "Okay." And end of the day, he meets us over by the General, and he says, "You guys want to get a photograph on the General?" And we're like, "Whoa!" So he let us sit on the pilot, and we took a photo. And
Uh-huh.
then I don't know if it was the day after, but he let each one of us, and then at one point, or no, it was all of us. He let us all in the cab,
Wow.
and it was like, stepping into like the tabernacle. It was like, oh man, it was so cool. It was a great end to a great trip.
Yeah, oh boy, I bet. You still have those
Yep.
photos?
I do. I do.
I'd love to see
Yep.
them.
I will definitely send them off to you. I'll just send them out to the group. So John, you asked a question earlier, or you said you're going to ask a question at the end, like who saw the General when it did its
Yeah,
ride?
I wanted to know. Of course, I was stuck out here in the West Coast, but I was, you know, like 10 years old, and I knew that the General was touring, and I was wondering how many of you other guys, perchance, were around at that time, and your parents took you to see the General.
I lived outside Chattanooga when I was a boy, so I saw the General quite often before the tour.
Yeah, you saw it in Chattanooga at the station.
Yes.
I
Mhm.
I saw it in Memphis when it came through Memphis under steam. Um, and Lee Miller, who has led our group, is in our group and has led it on several of our tours, was rode on the train. So, and my mother took me in too. In tow. I was 10 years also.
Wow.
Yeah, that was neat. That's something that probably nobody else will ever see again.
I was at the
Did you take?
64 World's Fair in New York, and I don't remember seeing it, but I'm wondering if some of my obsession with the Civil War and trains comes from seeing it.
Could be.
My,
Charlie,
mine did. Yeah.
yeah. Did you have any photos, Charlie or LeBron, from your
Yeah.
Because it was one of those things that it was just there and we never
Right.
took photographs of it.
right?
John Ott, I cannot believe all the photos that I have never seen before in your presentation.
Amen.
Yeah.
It's amazing, amazing.
Well, just grab them when I find them. Just the odd habit of collecting this stuff. But I'm an illustrator, and that's what illustrators do. They just grab visual material when they stumble across it.
And
Great
unfortunately,
job on mining that one photograph, John, of the destruction at Atlanta there. That was absolute absolutely lovely to find out about those two locomotives in the background there. That's something I don't think any of us knew until you showed us.
Yeah, well, again, if you go nosing around this photograph, there's all sorts of details in it. And you can get a good high resolution photograph, of course, from the Library of Congress.
Mm-hmm.
You can download I think it's about 150 megabytes or a TIFF file. And then you just start looking at it and man, you know, all these details, all the iron parts from all the cars are still there. And you know, oh look, there's link and pin coupler and there's brake staffs and there's chain winders and all the stuff that there's all sorts of garbage scattered around here. And it's a really interesting forensic problem, trying to figure out what happened. Why the general is positioned where it is, what the hell happened to the Missouri. I would have loved to see that, how, you know, what state that locomotive was in. Lost its tender, but we know that the locomotive was usable because that's another one that the Union Army hauled away and turned into a United States Military Railroads locomotive. That again, they never got around to repairing it, and they ended up giving it back to the Western and Atlantic.
There's a few questions in the chat, John. I'm going to leave some of these to watch the recording because I think some of the answers are in that. But one was of the rolling mill, the string of cars. They were initially destroyed by the rebels, or was it by Yankee cannon?
No, this was all destroyed by the rebels.
Right.
General John Bell Hood ordered that the two 40-car trains, mostly supplies, some ammunition, but he ordered that they be destroyed and the locomotives be destroyed so that they wouldn't fall into Union hands.
Right.
And that all happened on the night of September 1st as the Confederates were leaving Atlanta. And, you know, the scene at the rolling mill was what inspired the fire of Atlanta in the movie Gone with the Wind.
Right. There's a comment saying, I believe you can find documentation from the Louisville shops at the LNN Historical Society at their new complex at the, I guess it's Tennessee Valley Railroad Museum.
Oh, okay. That's a
So
good
that
lead.
could be a lead.
Go to their historical society. Okay.
Cool.
Well, I might just might do that.
Good. Tell you what, if you're done, can you stop your share?
Yes, I will. Hang on. Anyway, thank you guys for sticking around as long as you did.
Thank you, John.
Hopefully we didn't.
John.
Hopefully
Great
we didn't
work.
have any people jumping ship.
I wish I had gotten in earlier.
That was a wonderful presentation. Thank you, all.
Yeah, thank you, John. Awesome as always.
Very, very welcome.
I'm sorry I caught just the last 5 minutes of it though.
Well, you got the recording.
Yeah, remarkable, John. Thanks so much for all the work that you do into that, and as such a valued resource for us in our own research. Much appreciated, my friend.
You know, one thing it also made me think of, if you say a 40-car supply train, I assume you'd at least need 2 locomotives. That sounds like an awful lot of cars for those days.
Yeah, it kind of surprised me too. But I looked at the photograph and looked at the trains. It doesn't look to me like the train was broken up. Either one of the trains was broken up. In other words, the spacing of the cars was pretty much the same from beginning to end of the train.
Well, I know that
You know, Georgia's pretty flat.
Okay.
At least, you know, the line south from Atlanta, I guess they figured that whatever they had, they could haul it. And don't forget that the General was a big locomotive for its age.
Right.
It was a 22-ton locomotive. It was a freight hauler. It was not a passenger hauler. It was a big Rogers engine for its age, but it could probably haul 40, 50 cars without too much trouble.
I do recall from a couple of books, especially that book, Train Running for the Confederacy or with the Confederacy, they noted a number of times where trains were double-headed. So, you know, if it couldn't pull, I'm sure they would just rig a couple of locomotives. There was actually one comment in there where this guy was talking about how a train was being pulled and then they put a locomotive in the middle of the consist as a helper engine. So especially if you're doing operations on a modeling level, there's lots of cool configurations you can do. I mean, George, he helped me like figure out how to do the consist with a couple of the 4/4 rows, which was so cool. But yeah, that was a good question, Walter.
Well, yeah, and don't forget those two locomotives in the back of the train.
Yes.
They could have been there for a reason. They could have been helper engines, getting the cars into position.
Right. Charlie?
Yeah, Tom, I missed your comment about the Tennessee Valley Railroad Museum of what info you're looking for there.
It was in the chat, and he says, I believe you can find documentation from the Louisville shops at the L&N Historical Society at their new complex at the Tennessee Valley Railroad Museum.
All right, so Mark Brainerd helped from that museum, helped out with our Chattanooga convention several years ago. I mean, he's a very enthusiastic guy. He's a ton of fun. But at that time, I hadn't followed up. He also has had the privilege to look at documents that have not been digitized. I think that they're concentrated down there at the Kennesaw Museum. So I'll have to ask him again what he had, but I think it's from the Southern that they had some documents that were not digitized and they were trying to determine what would be useful. So he may have come across some things since, and I'll send you his contact stuff later.
Yeah, that would be really nice if we could open up another line of communication. And yeah, I didn't mean to imply that anybody at the museum or anyplace else had ulterior motives for this lack of documentation. If it's a museum, then you know it's the problem is time and money. They just don't have enough people and enough money to do whatever it is that they want to do. That's the story of every museum.
Yeah, to your point earlier, it's not so much they didn't want to disclose, but they might have either disappeared or got, you know, stashed someplace and somebody might not even know they exist. But Brainerd would be clearly a good lead.
Yeah, he might be.
Yep.
Good. Cool.
Yeah, please put it in a note. Get it
Right.
out there so we can work with it.
All right, gentlemen. Well, thank you all. It was great to see everybody. Again, thank you, Mr. Ott. I'm glad to see you're wearing the colors. Looks good on you. And we'll see you guys in 1 month from now, where we'll be featuring David Schneider on the railgun. You all be well.
Thank you, John.
Take care.
Thanks, Tom.
Thanks, John.
Good night now.
That was wonderful.
All right.
Hey.